Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for those of you who've joined us. We are going to go ahead and get started to be respectful of your time and to thank you for being with us right from the very beginning. My name is Robin Pierce and I'm the Capacity Building Specialist at Capacity for Health, and I'll be serving as your facilitator and presenter for today's webinar with my colleague Jacob Smith-Yang. Let's start with an introduction so I can tell you a bit about Capacity for Health and so you'll know what to expect from today's webinar. At Capacity for Health, we work with all kinds of HIV prevention programs across the country, as well as community-based organizations that support the health needs of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community. Today's webinar topic is in the area of organizational infrastructure and program sustainability, which is a long phrase that encompasses important elements of a high-functioning nonprofit organization, such as program management, strategic planning, and nonprofit board development. Today I'm presenting with my colleague Jacob Smith-Yang. Jacob is the Capacity Building Director at Capacity for Health, and he regularly provides board development training and facilitates strategic planning sessions. Before coming to Capacity for Health, Jacob served as an Executive Director for 10 years at a community-based organization in Boston. He also has extensive board member experience that he'll share with us today.
Hello, I am Jacob Smith-Yang, and I'm pleased to present my colleague Robin Pierce. Robin came to Capacity for Health after 4.5 years in New Orleans, where she coordinated the HIV testing program for No AIDS Task Force, and she also served on the board of a small nonprofit serving women and children.
Thank you, Jacob. So before we get started, please review this information to help us work together throughout the webinar. If you'd like to ask a question, please chat it in any time during the presentation. We may not be able to get to all your questions, but we'll do our best. There'll be times during the webinar for us to take your questions, and we'll have some little chat sections. And when you have something to say, please type it in using the chat function that you'll see on the right side of your screen. If you're viewing the webinar with several people around one computer, please chat in all participants' contact information so we can add you to the Capacity for Health list.
So the goal for the webinar today is to give an overview of the basic elements of nonprofit boards of directors. People often find themselves having to work with a nonprofit board without even a clear concept of how a board works and what one is supposed to do. I know for a fact when I was recruited to join my first board, I didn't know what a board really did. This webinar is intended to be useful for organizational staff who work with the board, executive directors, and board members. By the end of this webinar, we hope participants will have a better understanding of the purpose of a board of directors, increased knowledge of the major board roles and responsibilities, better skills to effectively recruit, orient, and retain a diverse board of directors, and stronger confidence to work effectively with your board. So before we get started, let's do a quick poll. We'd like to get a sense of your experience with boards of directors. So please go ahead and check the response that most closely applies to you. I have no experience working with a board of directors. I work or have worked closely with a board of directors on my organization, or I've served on the board of another nonprofit organization. So go ahead and enter your responses now. Okay, so as you can see here, we've got a variety of responses. Some folks have no experience working with the board, like me when I was first recruited onto my first board. And then some other folks have worked closely with their organization's board or have served on a board. And so this will create a nice mix of folks, and hopefully we'll have a chance to chat in with one another and learn from each other's experiences as we move forward in the webinar. So, today's webinar will cover topics of board development in the order shown on this slide, and we will use the agenda with a wood grain background to help show you where you are as we go. Finally, we'll summarize what we've covered, and we'll let you know where you can find some additional resources. We've included several opportunities to chat in about your experiences in this webinar, and as I said, we hope that this will not only give you opportunities to learn from one another's experiences, but also enhance your engagement. Back to you, Robin.
All right, so let's get started. We're going to begin by teaching you what nonprofit boards actually do. All right, so the relationship of a board to an organization may seem mysterious, especially for those of you who may be new to a board. And for those of you who might be new to the nonprofit sector, this also might be a little mysterious. Jacob and I are curious to know what you think this relationship is like. So we'd like to take a few seconds for you to complete the following analogy. Board is to organization as blank is to blank. So please chat in those responses so we can see what you all think this relationship is like. Maybe you all need a little bit of a prompt to help you. Some of the things that we've heard before are along the lines of a board is to an organization as perhaps a brain is to a body, or a conductor is to an orchestra. What sort of things have you experienced before as the relationship between the board and an organization? All right. Well, then we hope that by the end of the webinar today, you'll have a really clear sense of what that'll be. Some of the things that we've also heard in the past have been things along the lines of a board is to an organization as a hamster is to a hamster wheel. And that's because sometimes these roles can get a little confused and, are pretty diverse. But since every board is really different, it's not surprising that there's so many different ways that we can complete this analogy. However, there is an ideal way to imagine the relationship, and we'd like you to imagine the following. Board is to organization as cruising altitude is to sea level. So it's important for nonprofit organizations to have a board of directors who can look far ahead at what's coming next and strategically plan for the future. A board of directors provides perspective from 30,000 feet, allowing staff to focus on sea level where the work is getting done. Keeping the board at this high strategic place can give your organization the support and guidance you want. Now let's talk about what the board is actually doing in their meetings throughout the year. Nonprofit boards of directors typically have governing, financial, and legal responsibilities, as well as some other responsibilities as individuals and as the board. Governance, or running the organization, is one of the biggest responsibilities of a board of directors. When I served as a board member for a home for women and children in Louisiana, our governing responsibilities were in line with the list on this slide. During my 3-year term, we approved a mission statement that made the home transgender inclusive. We conducted an annual evaluation of the executive director. We revised the organization's strategic plan, and we reviewed a program activity report at each board meeting to monitor programs. Another very important responsibility of the board is to hire the executive director. This is especially important for a new nonprofit or an organization in the midst of an executive transition or an executive search. In some cases, a board member may be called upon to serve as the interim director until an executive director can be found. When most people think about a nonprofit board, they think about fundraising. And as you now know, this isn't the board's only responsibility, but it is, of course, a very important one. Many boards play a large role in fundraising. They may help staff establish a solid fundraising plan and raise or give contributions. You may have heard the phrase give or get, which means that board members must donate their own money or fundraise it. If you'd like to know more about the board's role in fundraising, please stay tuned for another webinar on this topic in early 2014. The board is also responsible for approving the annual budget and ensuring that proper financial controls are in place, such as an audit, which is when an outside entity reviews the finances of a nonprofit. As a group, the board is ultimately responsible for making sure this organization sticks to legal standards and ethical norms. Each member of the board has individual legal duties as well. According to the nonprofit corporation laws, a board member is responsible for meeting certain standards of conduct. The duty of care means that the board members will exercise responsible care or good judgment when making a decision as a representative of the organization. The duty of loyalty means the board members are to show allegiance when making decisions affecting the board. Board members can never use information obtained as members for personal gain and must always act in the best interest of the organization. The duty of obedience requires board members to be faithful to the mission. They're not permitted to act in a way that is inconsistent with the organization's central goals. A basis for this rule lies in the public's trust that the organization will manage donated funds to fulfill the mission. For example, a nonprofit that works to end bullying in schools can't suddenly decide to use their funding to support healthcare reform without getting the buy-in of their stakeholders and support of their funders. Board members also have responsibilities as individuals, the specifics of which will vary from board to board. In general, there are expectations for individual members related to meeting attendance, participating on committees, fundraising, and connecting the organization to their networks. It's important to lay out these individual responsibilities explicitly when recruiting and orienting board members so that they know what's expected of them. The board as a whole, or collectively, is also responsible for a variety of other important tasks. Each board is responsible for keeping itself going. All boards have to set prerequisites for candidates, orient new members, and periodically evaluate their own performance. Boards are also charged with making the organization look good, acting as ambassadors among key partners and the community. So now let's chat. We've covered the basic responsibilities of nonprofit boards of directors, and I'd like to hear from you. I encourage everyone to read over your colleagues' responses as they come in, and I'd really like you all to give us one answer to this question. What additional responsibilities does your organization's board have, or responsibilities that you've taken on when you were a board member? Let's see what you all have to say. So something that you may have seen before is that sometimes a board's responsibilities may change, especially if your board is pretty small. Oh, let's see, we've got one right now. Oh, I'm not seeing that. Oh, I see. Okay, great. So this is up in our question section. So you've seen boards lead projects before. Event planning, right? Event planning is definitely a way that one of the other responsibilities that boards may have. Funding cycles, right? So a board may really be in tune with the funding cycles that the different funders that provide support to the work that your organization does. Oh, this is great. So someone's mentioned that some of their board provides some direct contact, and they teach ESL as well as music classes. Right. So these are all great examples of ways that board members' experiences and responsibilities really may go outside these basic responsibilities that we just outlined. And of course, just like we said before, this will vary board to board. Right. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jacob so he can lead you through some information about the structure and composition of boards. Thank you all so much for your responses.
So now that we've talked about what the board does, let's move on to how it's set up or structured. In this section, we're going to pay special attention to the size, the diversity of the board, what officers do, and what the functions are of committees. So one thing you may have heard about is a distinction between a working board and a governing board. Maybe you've heard a comment like this, we are a working board, or we're just a working board, we're not a board. Or maybe we've been a working board, but we have to become a fundraising board. A question these statements beg is the opposite of a working board a non-working board? And is it true that governing boards don't do work? We'd say these comments reflect a common and completely understandable confusion between what a board does and what the board members do, which Robin alluded to earlier. What is usually meant by a working board is one where board members actively do the organization's work, whether it's enrolling clients into health care exchanges, to the Affordable Care Act, conducting HIV prevention, working at a fundraising booth at a fair, or maybe even keeping the organization's books. In other words, board members participate in program work, fundraising, and administrative work. This particularly can be the case early on before there are staff in an organization. When a board starts to talk about becoming less of a working board and more of a governing board, what it probably means is that the organization needs the board to change the focus of its work, from doing administrative work to overseeing the finance and administration, from doing program work to overseeing that program work, or from doing fundraising to, well, here's an exception and a catch. Boards both do fundraising and oversee fundraising as part of their charge. So there's actually a difference that's worth highlighting between what a board does acting as a group and what board members do individually. For example, the board as a whole hires the executive director, not the board chair or any one member. On the other hand, individual board members can offer mentoring to the executive director, but they do so as individuals, not as a body. And although we often say things like, our board raises the money, what we really mean is that board members raise the money. So for organizations with staff, the board will partner with the executive director in different ways, as both a governing body and a group of individual volunteers. And over time, the work of the board and board members will change to reflect what the organization needs. Just be careful, because this shift can cause role confusion for the staff and board members, so it's important that everyone's on the same page as these changes occur. In short, the work that the board does as a body is different from the work that board members will do as individuals. Both need to be done and are very important. So we prefer the phrase instead, we are a working board, and part of that work is the governance. So when it comes to the size of a board, one size does not fit all. In most states, there are laws that determine the minimum size for nonprofit boards. Usually it is 3, but in some states it can only be only one board member. At a minimum, in your bylaws, a minimum or a range of number of board members is usually set out. That said, each organization needs to decide its ideal board size, and that can change over time. And bylaws thus can be amended accordingly. But best board size really varies across organization and depends on the mission, the fundraising necessities, whether or not it's a local or national organization. Newly formed boards often start small and expand as programs and services expand. It's common to see large boards in older, more established organizations where fundraising is a big focus of the board. I once served on a board that actually had 65 members. Small community-based nonprofits are often governed by just a few devoted volunteers. And it's worth noting that a survey conducted by BoardSource found an average board size of roughly 16. So there are pros and cons. The pros of having a larger board include providing enough people to manage the workload, especially in terms of that fundraising, representing more perspectives, and lending more skills and expertise to help. For example, your organization may really benefit from specific expertise in law, accounting, or media relations. Of course, large boards can have cons too. Specifically, bigger boards may not be able to engage every member in a meaningful activity, and that can ultimately lead to some apathy and loss of interest. Meeting scheduling can be really cumbersome with a big board, and there may be a tendency to form cliques or core groups, which can be detrimental to overall board cohesion. It might be difficult to build and instill accountability in a big board, and opportunities for interactive discussions may be limited. And finally, if you decide by consensus, it may be harder to reach that consensus with a larger board. So what about small boards? Some pros of small boards may include communication and interaction will be a lot easier. Your board members may get to know one another as individuals better. Also, there may be better potential for satisfaction from their board service due to more frequent, direct, and meaningful involvement. And finally, scheduling the meetings and calls can be much easier. And what about the cons of small boards? Well, as you see on the slide, the heavy workload creates burnout, especially regarding fundraising, which can become a major burden on the shoulders of a few board members. Also, important opinions or points of view may not be represented by so fewly populated board. And any transition off the board can create significant strain on the remaining board members, not only in terms of the workload, but maybe it may put you out of compliance with the minimum membership set by your bylaws. So let's talk a little bit about who leads the board. At a minimum, boards of directors commonly include these officers, and I'm going to go through and review each briefly. So there's the chair, and when I served as the board chair, I oversaw board meetings. I worked with the executive director to make sure board decisions were carried out. I appointed the committee chairs, and with ED input, and recommended those who would serve on the committees. I assisted the executive director in preparing the agenda for board meetings, before each board meeting, and I assisted the ED and staff in conducting new board orientation. Another important part of my job was overseeing searches for a new executive director in instances where the executive director left the organization. I coordinated the ED's annual performance evaluation, and one big major role that the board chair holds is holding members accountable for their work, and that's an ongoing task throughout the year. So what does a vice chair do? A vice chair is an optional but useful board role. The vice chair is someone who understands the responsibilities of the board chair and is able to perform these duties in the chair's absence. They carry out special assignments as requested by the board chair. So if there's a special project or opportunity that comes up, the board chair can assign it to the vice chair to cover it. They serve on the executive committee if one exists, and usually this vice chair role is someone who's going to be groomed to be the next chair. So what about the secretary, which is also sometimes called the clerk? This role primarily ensures the safety and accuracy of all board records, reviews and submits for approval the board meeting minutes, and assumes the responsibility of the chair in the absence of the board chair and vice chair. The final officer I'll talk about is a very key role, the treasurer. She or he generally understands financial accounting for nonprofits, serves as the chair of the finance committee, manages with that committee the board's review of the organization's finances, which should be periodic, quarterly or perhaps monthly, works with the ED and the finance staff to ensure financial reports are made available to the board, not only on a timely basis, but in an understandable format. The treasurer presents the annual budget for board approval, very important, and finally reviews the annual audit and answers any board member questions that may arise. Detailed job descriptions for these positions are available on our Capacity for Health resource library website. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about board committees. Much of an effective board's work is done through committees and task force rather than on a full board. And this is primarily because there's simply not enough time to perform decision-making and governance functions as well as conduct the specialized and focused tasks a board needs to do all in one meeting. Usually committees recommend action to the full board for discussion and decisions. Most boards only need a few standing committees. Common standing committees might include an executive committee. And so the executive committee is made up of the officers and committee chairs, and they oversee the operation of the board. They often act on behalf of the board if something comes up in between meetings, and they usually perform the evaluation of the ED. Audit committee is another very common standing committee. The audit committee is in charge of drafting and putting out a request for proposals for someone to conduct the audit, interviewing prospective auditors, recommending selection of the auditor to the board, and then they really work with the auditor. They meet with them, they receive the auditor's report, and they respond to any recommendations that the auditor might make. And just a note, sometimes if you're working on a smaller board, the functions of the audit committee may be taken on by the finance committee, which is a great segue to the Finance Committee. The Finance Committee oversees development of the organizational budget. They ensure accurate tracking and monitoring and accountability for funds and their expenditure. They make sure that there are adequate financial controls in the organization. Usually this committee is led by the board treasurer, as I mentioned, and they review major grants and their terms to make sure that the organization is in compliance with them. Finally, and of most interest to many folks, is the Fundraising Committee. This committee oversees the development and implementation of a fundraising plan. It works with the staff to identify and solicit funds, and sometimes we call it the Development Committee. So those are some standing committees, very common, but it really is up to an organization to determine what committees work best for them. And some things to think about in terms of that is how many board members do you have? What special projects or strategic directions do you want to go in? Sometimes additional work and special projects are taken on by task forces or ad hoc committees. And it's within the realm of a board to set those up as they are needed. Remember, you don't want to have committees convene or meet with no work to do. So just a word about committee effectiveness. To set the stage for efficient and effective committee work, and board work, boards can use several strategies listed on this slide. So really sitting down and relating it to the agency priorities, making sure you have a strong chair to lead committees, to lead you through the goals, assigning work as appropriate and related to people's interests, and really, and perhaps very importantly, to be brief and focused. Again, people have limited time, so it's very important that meetings really be action-focused. And then finally, and sometimes this is often skipped over with folks, really spend some time acknowledging accomplishments. So next, let's talk for a minute about composition and diversity. Dimensions of board diversity can include race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, professional background, skills, age, and connections to the community that the organization serves. We would say that diversity is essential to an organization's success, and establishing an inclusive organization starts with a diverse and inclusive board. So, a homogeneous board can result in nearsightedness and groupthink. So what is groupthink? This is when a group's desire to get along or for conformity really causes them to unconsciously make bad decisions. And I've served on boards in the past who make a lot of noise about the fact that they all get along really well, and isn't that a great thing? Well, it can be a really great thing, and rapport and getting along is important, but you want to avoid something called groupthink. By contrast, a heterogeneous board, one composed of individuals with many skills, perspectives, and backgrounds, really can bring creativity and innovation to the organization. And boards that are representative of the communities served by the organization really can increase the understanding of community needs that is essential for the board as it does its work. Finally, diverse boards are more likely to attract diverse donors. And grant makers are increasingly focused on diversity. For those of you who are staff or have been involved in grant writing, you might be familiar with detailed board diversity forms that are often required to accompany your proposals. So there are a couple questions an organization can ask itself around diversity, and we would offer these to you. Are the people from diverse communities comfortable serving on the board? Another one is, does the board consider issues related to race and ethnicity when it sets policies and makes decisions for the organization? Also, what could the board do differently to become more inclusive and welcoming? And what could the board do to address the needs of all members better? These questions can also be tailored to address diversity in any specific areas, such as sexual orientation, gender identity, age, and other ways in which people are diverse. And a board or an organization will use these questions as they sort of take an inventory and decide what dimensions of diversity they really need to build on their board. So let's chat. We want to hear from you. Let me pose a few questions and chat in your responses as they occur to you. But one question we wanted to ask and put forward was, how has a diverse board benefited your work? Or, on the other side of that, what challenges have you experienced around board diversity? Please chat in your responses now. Just bear with us as we're waiting for some responses. So we have a comment, board diversity is critical and brings out-of-the-box ideas to planning. You know, this is a very good point and really builds on this section. I think what I would add to this is that really think out of the box as you're doing your planning for diversity, because there may be folks from other sectors, not just from the nonprofit sector, who might bring value to your board. So that's in the dimension of skills or background, but think really broadly about who might bring value to your work, and especially as our nonprofit and community-based organization work becomes more complex, there's even more of a demand to bring in that diversity onto a board. So we have a participant who says, a challenge I face with board diversity is being the minority, youngest board member, and the person of color. And so this touches on something that is not an uncommon experience. Many times people come onto boards and they are brought on for their diversity, but that sometimes can be an isolating experience. And so in terms of a challenge, one thing you can do is try to find resources in your area or online that might support your board service. There are a number of resources that we'll be talking about towards the end of this webinar that might help you. There also might be community of color nonprofit groups, affinity groups for board members that can provide support, but going it alone can be really difficult. So trying to find someone, if not on the board you serve, especially if you're the only one, but maybe through a professional network, finding someone else who's in a similar situation on another board can help buddy you up with someone who can really give you some support and maybe some tips. But that can be a very isolating experience, but it also is a very important thing for folks to do, just in terms of bringing diversity and perspectives to the board. So I guess my encouraging words would be to persevere through that experience, but do try to find support. Okay, we have another comment. We are making sure we have members representing different ethnicities, which is important for the credibility across multiple groups. The challenge with our size, and they have 13 members, is that there's a core group of people that end up doing most of the work. We're a working board. We're struggling to find a way to engage a bigger group while understanding people have other commitments. So this really speaks to that balance, that leadership challenge that faces board leaders in terms of creating a space on the board that invites and engages people in to do more work and holds people accountable for that work. And so while acknowledging, of course, that people are busy volunteers. And so we'll talk a little bit about this moving forward in the webinar, but it really is sort of something you have to trial and error on your own board in terms of if you feel like at any given time very few people are doing most of the work, ask yourself the question, well, what is the thing we could do to change that dynamic? Is there a task? Is there a committee? Is there a project that we could put out to the further group? Maybe invite folks who aren't working on other projects right now to start something, and then build from there. So board culture and board dynamics are very challenging and difficult sometimes to manage and shift. But really, it's up to leadership, and leadership can come from board leadership, come from the executive director, and then also staffs of organizations can help with the leadership of organization boards as well in terms of shifting that dynamic. And of course, if you want to follow up with us after the webinar, we're happy to talk to you some more about that. Okay, so in the interest of time, we're going to have to move on. My apologies if we didn't get to your question. We will try to chat it in as we move forward. And now I'm going to turn it back to Robin.
So now that we know what boards do and what they look like, let's talk about how to build your board. The next 3 sections, we're going to review how to recruit, orient, and retain your board members. Capacity for Health is in the process of developing a webinar to board member recruitment, so today's discussion on this topic will be really brief. We're going to focus on preparing to recruit new members, casting a wide net, and your first recruitment conversations with a potential board member candidate. So board recruitment can often sometimes become more about finding any warm body to fill a seat on the board rather than the right person for the job. But this is a situation where you do not want the urgency for bringing on new board members to override the importance of thoughtfully bringing on the right ones. There are many ways to go about recruiting board members. You may recruit annually or only whenever there is a vacancy. However frequently you may recruit, you'll want to follow these 4 steps to find the right people for your board. First, identify your organization's strategic priorities by reviewing your strategic plan. And if your organization is preparing to shift directions, your priorities might be uncovered through a strategic planning process. Once you know where you're heading, proceed to step 2 and consider what skills and expertise your organization will need to achieve those goals. Third, take a look at your current board members. What skills and experience do they have? Where are your gaps? Are there key people you need to have to elevate your conversations and make your thinking more strategic? Lastly, create a plan to fill the gaps you've identified by recruiting new board members. You know, as many of us know, as the HIV/AIDS and healthcare landscapes change, many organizations are expanding their services, reorganizing, and creating strategic plans for sustainability that involve clinics and healthcare centers. In order to make these changes successfully, organizations need board members with experience in clinic administration, services such as maternal health and STD testing and treatment, and more. This kind of change is significant, and a new board recruitment strategy will be required to make sure the right people are added to the board. It'll also require boards to look in new places for new members, which leads us to this next topic of casting a wide net. Where do you find new board members? Well, first of all, board members are people like you who care about their community or particular issue, and they want to commit time and energy to advancing these causes. So you may find your next board member volunteering for your organization, or in the membership of a professional network related to your work. Casting a wide net when recruiting new members is important because boards will often approach people they know in their same social or professional networks, which can result in a pool of candidates without much variation. And as Jacob just reminded us, diversity is really important on a board. So encourage your board to break out of this rut and use some ideas from the list you can see on this slide. Programs like Board Match are really helpful ways to connect professionals who want to serve in their community to nonprofits who need new board members. So once you have someone in mind as a potential board member, there are some key things you should consider in your initial recruitment conversation. Let's review them now. First, find out if the person is interested in the mission of your organization. In order to retain board members, which we'll talk about in a moment, tapping into their individual interests is key. You should take some time to share your own passion with this potential board candidate. What led you to work for this nonprofit or serve on its board? After the two of you find some common ground, it's a good idea to be explicit about individual responsibilities so candidates know what they're getting themselves into. Be clear about the time commitment, such as how many times you meet per year, as well as any financial commitment or fundraising expectations. If your organization works in the field of HIV/AIDS prevention and you expect board members to volunteer time doing prevention education in the community, it might be a good idea to make sure the person feels comfortable talking about condoms and safer sex. Lastly, remember that board recruitment may take more time than you expect, especially if you're expanding your board's capacity or changing direction. So prepare accordingly. All right, so now we want to hear from you. What new, different, or creative ideas has your organization used for recruiting new board members? Great. So Jacob just got a comment about the challenges that we end up recruiting board members who are our friends. So what do we do when your network might be limited to people who are similar to you? That's a great question. So fortunately, there's been more and more attention to board development in the past 10 years than there ever was before, and there are ways that you can network with people, at events in various cities to find people who might be interested in serving on boards. So even just taking a moment to find some sort of nonprofit professional group, or perhaps even like a large umbrella organization like Idealist, and going to a career fair might be a good way for you to get your organization's name out into the community for you to meet some other people who might be interested, who are looking for a board to work on. But yes, it is certainly challenging to find people who you trust, because you want to make sure that you have people you can work with on your board. So breaking out of your normal group can be very challenging. So it just requires you to look a little bit further outside than where you've been looking before. We also have a chat in right now, a recruitment strategy to using special events, right? So using existing members to recruit within their networks, participating in a moth session. Moth is an interesting community program. I suggest everyone, you can do a quick Google search, but it's a kind of a convening of people in communities to share stories and to create community with each other, and that can be a place to meet new people who are concerned about their community. But of course, yes, asking other people within your organization to help recruit for your board is also a great strategy. So, looking within your existing volunteers and maybe looking from within your staff to find other people who might be interested in that work can be a good way to expand that. So it's not just the board doing the recruitment, but that everyone in the organization is also actively looking for more people to bring on to the leadership. Great. Well, thank you so much. We're going to move along, and Jacob is going to chat now about orientation.
So now that you've recruited fabulous, committed, solid new board members, how do you ensure that they know what to do in order to fulfill their responsibilities effectively? Let's take a look at new member orientation and training. As with the section on recruitment, today's overview will be very brief because we are in the process of developing a webinar, and we actually have resources on this in our resource library online. In this section, we're going to look at suggested topics for board orientation and spend a little bit of time talking about conflicts of interest. So, who is responsible for board orientation? Is it the board? Is it the staff? Is it both? Well, really, this is one of those answers, it depends. It arguably could be both. It may be very helpful for both new and current board members to attend, as well as staff who interact with the board. For board members who are already serving, it might be a nice refresher. It's a nice opportunity to bond and network with the newer members. And also for staff, it may be an important opportunity to meet board members, to interact with them, and to sort of counter that idea that there isn't enough time between staff and board members to get to know each other. The takeaway here is it's important to consider your board orientation design and who optimally is going to be involved from your agency. But before we get there, what should you cover, you ask? So an orientation meeting should occur shortly after a new board member or board members are selected. And it can perhaps be a full day, if you can afford that, maybe a half day, or if things are really tight, maybe even over an evening meal. And this is an important investment of time that sets up the board members for success, giving people the resources and a foundation that they need to really inform their board service. So in an orientation, you want to discuss board member roles and responsibilities, including meeting attendance, committee participation, and fundraising. You'll want to review the bylaws, maybe summarizing them and perhaps providing them in a binder of written materials. A nice thing to do is often to have the longest-serving board member, with help from other folks, provide a historical overview of the organization. That can give important context for people to understand the organization that they're getting involved with. It's good and promising practice to provide a financial overview, and again, this will be accompanied by materials in a binder. Discuss the current strategic plan and direction for the organization. This might be also an opportunity, if you have more time, to establish funding, programmatic leadership, and other goals for the next 6 months to a year. And finally, talk about how conflicts of interest, which we're going to talk about in a minute, are handled on the board. And then what is really good is to give them an upcoming schedule for the entire year so they know and can mark their calendar in terms of when they're expected to be at meetings. So the list of orientation topics on this slide is available at the Capacity for Health website. As I said, it's worth spending an extra couple minutes to talk a little bit about conflicts of interest in detail. So a conflict of interest exists when a personal or professional concern of a board member affects her or his ability to put the welfare of the organization before personal benefit. So I can offer an example. On a board on which I served, a member was also employed by the health center that the organization subcontracted with to do our HIV testing. So when and if we had to make a decision about this subcontract, he might not be able to put his welfare, the welfare of our organization, before the monetary interests of the one that he worked for. But don't panic. Nonprofit board members are likely to be affiliated with many organizations, both professionally and personally. It's not unusual to have potential or actual conflicts of interest. And a conflict of interest doesn't necessarily disqualify a candidate. One of the best things you can do is have some self-monitoring in terms of preventing conflicts of interest becoming a problem for your organization. But it's also useful to create a conflict of interest policy and have each board member sign a statement regarding it. Conflict of interest policy should be reviewed regularly as part of the board self-assessment. And generally these policies have two essential elements. One is called full disclosure. So this specifies that board members in decision-making roles will make known their connections with groups doing business with the organization. This information should be provided at least annually, but we would also say it's incumbent on board members to remind the board of these relationships as these discussions arise. And then abstention from discussing and voting. Board members who have an actual or potential conflict of interest should not participate in discussions or vote on matters affecting transactions between the organization and the other group that they have an interest in. So for example, in my example, even though this conflict of interest potentially existed, that board member would always abstain from discussions that involved his organization's subcontract or the HIV testing program in generally, just to make sure that the conflict of interest was not a problem. And then just briefly, as part of an audit, many times these conflicts of interest will have to be identified and surfaced, so it is again good to have a policy that shows that you are managing them and addressing them. And now, back to you, Robin.
Thanks, Jacob. So as you can tell, a lot of time and effort goes into recruiting and training new board members. Of course, this means you want to make a concerted effort to retain those board members for as long as their term limits allow. Using some input from GuideStar, a philanthropy support nonprofit, we've compiled a list of 10 tips for retaining your board members. First, keep your board connected to their passion. It's easy for board members to feel disconnected from direct services, and this can impede their motivation to serve. An easy way to reconnect them is to create some space during a meeting for board members to share their answers to the question, why are you here? You can have a few members share at each meeting, or use this as a longer activity during a board retreat. So like if your board is large, you can break them into small groups or pairs to help build their relationships with each other, as well as reconnect them to their purpose. Tip number 2, align their interests to their assignments. Jacob mentioned this earlier, and so I want you to consider this from a board member's perspective. Board members don't want to play a passive role. They want to do meaningful work and see real results. They also might want an opportunity to flex their muscles beyond their current job duties. For example, let's say you recruit a CPA to your board. Don't make assumptions and automatically appoint this person to your finance committee. This person might prefer to support a logo redesign project. Also, remember to keep your board meetings focus on big picture issues from way up in cruising altitude. Ask your board to wrestle with the big picture rather than getting stuck in the details of program delivery. They can leave that to staff. There may be some times when eyes on details are important, such as reviewing an annual budget, but most of the board's work should be about direction. Also, give them social time. Give the board an opportunity to meet each other during a happy hour, a potluck, or some other fun activity outside the boardroom. You can't create a sense of team without giving them a chance to know each other, and this social time will encourage community and collegiality among them. Also, we also want to make sure that you focus your board members on action items to accomplish, not just on attending meetings for the sake of attending meetings. If all your board is doing is attending meetings, then you're going to have a board, and a board isn't going to be an action-oriented board. Long-term projects and complex decisions will likely require several meetings before an item can be moved off the to-do list. So keep your board focused on the progress that they've made and what work remains to do before it's complete.
One key ingredient I cannot stress enough is to build a board culture of leadership that holds members accountable. This means being explicit about what is generally expected by board members, but also assigning tasks to board members who can achieve them and with specific hard deadlines. It also means that the chair and other leaders create a sense of the importance of the work and hold people accountable through frequent check-ins on tasks delegated and giving feedback when tasks of the board or in the committees fall through the cracks. And sometimes this can mean having what feel like difficult conversations, but that's really part of the board's job. Another effective technique is to remind the board of how their work impacts the direct service or creates impact in the community. Board members so often come to the board because they want to be a part of something larger than themselves. It's good for the staff, the chair, and other leaders to remind folks about the impact of their work. Boards can get focused on the minutiae of governance, financials, and an audit. It's hard work. Keeping their mind on the help that they're providing to the community will help you retain them. Also, opportunities for board development trainings outside the organization can go a long way to build your board's effectiveness and capacity. This slide names some well-known resources for board development: Compass Point, Board Source, GuideStar, which Robin mentioned earlier, and of course Capacity for Health. We would urge you to consider setting aside some money, some resources for board development in your budget. But if that's not an option, look for free in-person trainings, online links, articles, resources, anything you can do to share training opportunities with your board. Speaking of opportunities, let's talk a little bit about reframing asking board members for stuff as offering opportunities. Sometimes staff, even EDs or board chairs, are reluctant to ask the board to do things because they are concerned that the board is too busy. In reality, giving the board opportunities to serve is one of the reasons they are there. Board members are often hungry to find out more about your organization and get involved. If you're concerned about taxing board capacity, let board members know. They can tell you if an ask is too much. But don't hold back on opportunities for them to support this organization. And finally, and I mentioned this before, take the time to appreciate the efforts that board members make. This is another technique that ultimately builds accountability. If you positively reinforce task completion, board members are more likely to follow through in the future. So take opportunities, both big and small, formal and informal, to thank them. Remember, they're volunteers. So it could be something as informal as a comment after a meeting or an email the next day, or you can think about formal mechanisms like acknowledge them in your minutes, in your newsletter, on your website. So try to be creative about how you appreciate your board members to keep them motivated and satisfied.
So in the interest of time, we're actually going to keep moving forward and chat. I'm not spending time reviewing your chats. However, if you do have some ideas about ways that retention strategies have worked, or retention strategies that have worked for you, please chat them and so we can share those with everyone and they can see that during the rest of our conversation. So now we're going to move back to Jacob and talk a little bit about evaluation.
So as with anything, any group, any program, any process, it's really important to evaluate a board of directors on a regular basis. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about the approaches you can take to evaluating your board. The question really is, how can a board be more effective? And the first step is to understand the gap between where the board is now and where it wants to be in three key basic areas: the board itself and how it functions, the performance of the executive director, and the agency's progress towards achieving the mission and the strategic plan it set out for itself. So there are several useful techniques that can be used in combination to evaluate a board's performance and identify areas for improvement. You can do surveys of staff, constituents, and stakeholders about their perceptions. More specifically, and we would recommend that you administer a board self-assessment among members on a fairly regular basis. You might look at retention rates and what's going on. If you've got a lot of attrition and offboarding, that might be a red flag. So you might also consider conducting exit interviews to talk to folks about what's going on as they exit the board. And finally, there's something that we call, and is called, using dashboards. So what's a dashboard? Consider that a dashboard in a car gives instant updates on some really important factors: speed, gas left in the tank, engine temperature, whether your trunk is open, whether the air conditioning is on. A non-profit dashboard works similarly. It gives important information to decision makers such as the board and staff in a quick read way. And on this next slide you'll see we provide an example of a couple components that could go into the dashboard. So you can see it looks like a table, or can look like a table. And in this example, there are elements measuring how the board is working in the first and third rows. And then in the middle row, about the executive director performance, you see something that really assesses how the executive director is doing. And you could add a dimension on achieving the mission. For example, it could be something like reaching 500 community members through our programs throughout the year. And then in the handout that we're going to make available, we have many more resources and examples in detail and dashboards that you can take advantage of. Back to you, Robin.
All right, well, it looks like it's time to wrap up everything that we've covered. We've covered quite a bit of information, so we want to review together what it is that we spent our time talking about today. So first, we spent some time talking about the what of nonprofit boards, and we explained that it's important to keep the board flying at cruising altitude so that they can govern and fulfill their financial and legal duties. Next, we talked about the fact that boards come in many shapes and sizes and that they all have their pros and cons. We also discussed that board work is often done in committees, and common standing committees include finance, audit, governance, and fundraising. And the boards are also led by a chair, a vice chair, a treasurer, and secretary. But of course, you can also create other titles depending on the size and capacity of your board. Jacob mentioned many compelling reasons to build a diverse board, and we also discussed some of those challenges that can come when trying to achieve diversity as well as perhaps being the diversity on your board. Then we also took you through some of the how to build your board. We described how to recruit board members, how to orient and train them, how to retain them, and how to evaluate their effectiveness and how to help them evaluate their own progress. Even though we covered so much information, there's still much more to be said about nonprofit boards, board-staff relationships, the role of the board in fundraising, how to motivate your board, and much, much more. We hope you'll join us for more board development webinars in the future. So as we close, we'd like to hear from you one more time to find out one strength in one area you think your board is strong in, one area in which your board could improve, and one thing you will do to enhance your board after this training. Please take a moment to chat in those responses for us. Sorry, we think some of you are sending something in, but we're having trouble seeing the response. Oh, there we go, at the very top. Great, so we've got a great comment from Jennifer that board diversity is critical and brings out of-the-box ideas to planning. Awesome. Also, strength is getting to know the staff, so a board that gets to know their staff and what their and what the staff's responsibilities are within the program. Great. Well, we hope that you can take away, the information that you've heard today will help you take away a sense of where your board is strong, where you have an opportunity for growth, and some ideas for what you can do to move forward in that process.
So briefly, here are some additional resources from the Capacity for Health website. And you can see on the slide that's a screenshot of the resource library that's online. The slides, a handout, and the recording of today's webinar will be posted. And there are many other organizational infrastructure resources on this site, so please check it out, as well as some very specific ones to HIV evidence-based interventions and program monitoring and evaluation. And finally, a shameless plug for our own free services. The Capacity for Health program is funded by the CDC to provide, and I said free, capacity building assistance to community-based organizations involved in HIV prevention across the U.S. and its affiliated Pacific jurisdictions. We work in 3 key areas, which are outlined on the slide, and really think about getting in touch with us if you need anything around individual capacity building assistance. We also do face-to-face trainings and workshops. And finally, this is where you can find us. Both Robin and myself, feel free to drop us a line by email or by phone. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. We hope this webinar will be helpful for you in your work moving forward. And we also want to thank our support for this webinar, AJ Titong and Vanessa Laurel on the Capacity for Health PI-AHF staff were instrumental in supporting us in this webinar. And we at Capacity for Health send you the best wishes for much board success in 2014. Thank you.